We have hundreds of manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, and no two are exactly the same. From spelling errors to deliberate, theologically driven changes, each scribe put their own mark on the Gospel. Today, Dr. Bart Ehrman joins me to discuss the hows and the whys of these rewrites. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Welcome back, everybody, to Misquoting Jesus, where today we are talking about what changes scribes made to the Gospel of Mark. We've also got listeners' questions at the end, where I'll be asking whether the writers of the Gospels were influenced by Greek literature, so be sure to stick around for that. Before all of that, though, Bart, how are you today?
I'm doing quite well. I've got just a few weeks left in my teaching career, and so and as I've been writing letters of recommendation and meeting with students, which I enjoy doing, but and as I have committee meetings and things, I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to be great. So so I'm looking forward to that. Even though I'm going to very much miss the undergraduate classroom. So how are you doing these days?
Also good. Not teaching undergraduates. I had a presentation for a group of high schoolers a couple of weeks ago, which was really fun. I love talking to them. I do the same thing for this school every year, and they always have fantastic questions. And I try each time to update my presentation to try and address the questions that the previous class asked, and they always find even better ones the next year. So
are you teaching them Akkadian?
No, they do a semester on the Epic of Gilgamesh and narrative and Mesopotamia and that kind of thing. So after they've read the epic, they get me in to do like a background of this is Mesopotamia. So it's like the fastest whistle-stop tour through Mesopotamian history that I've ever done in my life. But It's a lot of fun.
Wow. Okay. High school kids reading Gilgamesh. Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, our opening question for today. Do you ever reread your own books or re-listen to Misquoting Jesus episodes?
Well, I don't re-listen to Misquoting Jesus episodes, but I listen every Tuesday morning when it comes out. I teach on Tuesday mornings, and I can get the entire episode in between driving to classes and driving back from classes. So I do that every time to kind of see, how if there are things we could improve, things that could be better. Last week, as I was pointing out to you, my sound level was terrible. We probably got comments on, and I think I had the wrong microphone hooked in and I didn't check. I don't know what happened, but so I absolutely do, because I want this to be as good as it can be. In terms of my books, I think I've only reread one of my books from cover to cover, which I mentioned earlier. My book Jesus Interrupted, which I did a few months ago, but every now and then, even for these episodes, like for today's episode, I have a couple of books that deal with these kinds of issues, and I decided to read what I had said there, and I learned a lot. It's amazing. When you read, it's kind of like, when you take your PhD exams and you know so much because you studied for a year studying for these exams. You go back like years later and read your exam and say, wow, I knew all that.
I used to know a lot of stuff.
Wow, what happened to me? So I do. Yes, I do on occasion, but I don't read entirely, but I'll read sections of books. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The further away from publication you get, does it become easier to reread your work? Because I've just finished the final stages of editing one of Josh's Hebrew books, and I don't want to sit and read that again for a while, because I've had to go through it so many times.
No, I don't look at anything that within the last few years or anything like that. But like if I wrote a book 20 years ago, so my book Misquoting Jesus, that this podcast is named after, was written 20 years ago, and I was reading parts of it today, and I was realized, sometimes you read things and you think, God, boy, I messed that one up. But then I was thinking, actually, I couldn't do it any better now. I mean, it's as good as I could do, and so that's gratifying. At least, I mean, it doesn't mean it's great, but it means like, at least I did my best.
Now, as you indicated in our last episode, we don't have the originals of any of the books of the New Testament, which includes Mark. So, what are our oldest, our earliest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel?
Okay, so to put it in context, kind of broader context, if Jesus died probably around the year 30, say, Mark's Gospel is usually thought to have been written around the year 70. And the story is that he wrote it in Rome he wrote it in Rome. And so suppose that's true. He wrote it in Rome, suppose around the year 70. So we don't have that thing that he wrote. We don't have the original thing that he wrote and then started circulating within his church or whatever. And we don't have, somebody made a copy of it. We don't have that copy, and we don't have a copy of that copy, and so forth. The first time we have any kind of copy of Mark in a manuscript, the word manuscript means handwritten, and so everything was handwritten. And so the first manuscript we have is a partial copy from around the year 200. And it's called P45 because P for papyrus. It's written on papyrus, as most of the earliest manuscripts were. And it's 45 because it's the 45th one that was discovered and cataloged by the official group that does that. And so it's P45. It has portions of half of Mark's chapters. So Mark is 16 chapters long. It has parts of 8 of those chapters. And so the majority of the gospel is missing. We don't have a complete copy of Mark from verse 1 to verse whatever, from beginning to end, until the end of the 4th century, around the year 375. We have a couple of manuscripts, usually called Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. And those two manuscripts are our oldest complete manuscripts of Mark, and they're dated around the year 375 or so. But that means that this book has been in circulation, being copied, with copies of the copies being copied for 300 years before we have a manuscript of it.
So, apart from these manuscripts, which are quite a long time after we think Mark was writing, are there other ways of knowing what he wrote? Or are we just, this is what we have and we do our best?
No, there are other ways, but they're also involved manuscripts because the only way we have information from the ancient world is either archaeological evidence, which won't help us here, or we have writings. And so it's got to all be writings in one way or another. And so there are two other major sources of information for Mark or any of the parts of the New Testament or any other Christian or non-Christian writings are, first of all, these books. Mark was translated at some point into other languages for people who lived in non-Greek speaking areas. And so already in the 2nd Christian century, Mark was probably copied in Latin and in Syriac, which is related to Aramaic, and in Coptic. And then later we have other things. And so if you have Latin, Coptic, and Syriac manuscripts, then you can tell how it's being translated in the 2nd century, which would tell you what these copyists had available to them in the 2nd century. But we don't have the original copies of the Latin, Syriac, and Coptic translations. We only have manuscripts from much later for those. So you have to reconstruct those based on later manuscripts to see what their editors had for Mark's Greek. Okay, so that's one thing. You got the other versions. And then the third thing you have are the quotations of Gospels in church fathers living at certain times and places. So my PhD dissertation focused on the quotations of the Gospels in at the time, famous teacher named Didymus the Blind in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. And I analyzed his quotations of Mark and the other Gospels to see how he quoted them in order to reconstruct what his manuscripts looked like at the time he was writing. But the problem is we don't have the original writings of Didymus either, or any other church father. We have manuscripts that have been copied of them. So it's all manuscripts and it's all differences. But with this combination of evidence, since it's such different kinds of evidence, manuscripts written different times and places, versions written different times and places, church fathers different times and places, you can actually, if you sift through all this evidence, which is really a very major undertaking, you can come up with pretty much what you're pretty sure in most places the author wrote.
So if we're using all of this different kinds of evidence, as I said, they have differences between them. The manuscripts are not identical. People make mistakes, people make changes. So what kind of textual changes have scholars identified in the Gospel of Mark?
Well, they're the same kinds of changes you find in every book of the New Testament. As you say, there are lots of them. Um, my the thing I often say is something my teacher in this field was Bruce Metzger, and he was, I think everybody agrees, he was the greatest textual scholar in the United States, probably in the world in the 20th century. And I wanted to study with him because of that, and so he was my teacher, and he used to say something that I say all the time. When I say it, people get really upset. When Metzger said it, they just kind of took it in stride. But what he used to always say is that there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And that's absolutely true. If you take the entire, all the manuscripts, just the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, the current estimates are that there's something like 500,000 differences among them. But as you pointed out, and as Metzger is quick to say, and as I'm always quick to say, although people don't notice it when I say it, the deal is most of these differences don't matter for anything. Because if a scribe spells a word differently from some other scribe, that's a difference. And so, so there's misspellings. Scribes accidentally leave out words. Sometimes scribes will leave out a sentence. Sometimes they'll leave out a whole thing. I mean, or sometimes they'll write a word twice. Sometimes, there are all sorts of mistakes that these people are human beings, and they're, a lot of them are copying when it's like, it's a long day's job and they're tired and they're sleepy or they're inattentive and they make mistakes. So you have a lot of accidental mistakes. They're usually fairly easy to detect, not always, but usually. But you also have places where scribes in Mark and in other books, it sure looks like they've done something intentionally to the text, where it looks like they've changed it on purpose. You can't get into their heads to decide what their motives are or what their purposes were. You can't, we don't even know who these people were. But there are some changes that clearly, they look pretty clear. This was not made by a slip of the pen.
Have you ever come across what looks like an accidental change that does actually alter the meaning of a sentence?
Oh, God, all the time. Yes. Because the thing is, a lot of accidental changes are made precisely because they make sense. In other words, if a scribe's copying, suppose like in English, you have homonyms, you have words that sound the same, like the word see. Is it S-E-E or S-E-A? Well, usually in the context you can tell, but there are some homonyms that just sound exactly like, okay, here's a case from the book of Revelation. I'm sorry, I'm just coming up with something off the top of my head here. In the early book of Revelation, it says that that Christ, the blood of Christ washed people of their sins, luo. But other manuscripts say that the blood of Christ loosed or released people from their sins, luo. It sounds exactly the same. Luo, luo. One means to wash, one means to release. And if a scribe is like taking, like you have, sometimes in ancient, the way sometimes it worked, you'd have a scriptorium, a room where writings were made, where you'd have a monk in front of the room reading like Paul's letter to the Romans or reading the book of Revelation. And there'd be 3 or 4 other scribes who are writing down what he's reading so they can do 3 or 4 at once. Okay. So they're writing down what they're hearing, but if they hear a word that sounds, it's the same word, it can change the meaning. And so that happens in Revelation. But like in another case where that happens, it actually affects the meaning rather severely. In Romans chapter 5, verse 1, sorry, we'll get to Mark in a second, but in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, Paul says, now that we've been justified by God, we have peace with him. But some manuscripts say, now that we've been justified by God, let us have peace with him. Well, which is it? The word is echomen, and the two differences in English are echomen and echomen. They sound just alike. And so is he exhorting people to have peace with God, or is he saying you do have peace with God? And as it turns out, historically, Roman Catholics have preferred one reading and Protestants another. Protestants want to say, yes, you already have peace with God. Roman Catholic, I mean, so according, these are different ways of interpreting the verse. And so, yeah, accidents happen and sometimes they're meaningful. And then it makes it really hard to figure out what the original text was.
So, can you give us an example of some of the accidental changes people might see in Mark if they're going to do some manuscript studies?
Well, they'll see if they actually read manuscripts, they're going to see lots of misspelled words and things left out and things. There are some changes that could be either accidental or intentional. And I think the most important one actually occurs in verse 1. and so
Off to a good start.
off to a good start, because verse 1 is often taken by interpreters. Maybe majority of interpreters think that what is now Mark verse 1 was originally Mark's title for his gospel. And it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay. And then he starts talking about John the Baptist, and he starts with his gospel. But the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The problem is that the phrase the Son of God is missing from some of our ancient witnesses, both from church fathers and from a manuscript or two. And you wonder, Son of God, wow, that's pretty important to Mark. Mark's entire gospel is intended to show that Jesus is the Son of God, even though nobody recognizes him. And that the Son of God thing is really big for Mark. And so it would make sense that he starts by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The question, it's a very difficult issue to solve, though, whether it originally said Son of God or not, because it's missing in some manuscripts. And you can argue either way. And so the way to argue that it's an accidental slip is, see, all of these things are kind of complicated, but I'll try not to sound like I'm in the weeds. But the words Jesus Christ and the word Son of God and the phrase Son of God, both of those words in manuscripts are abbreviated. They use abbreviations for the sacred names. This is called the nomina sacra, the sacred names. When scribes copied manuscripts and they wrote the word Jesus, they didn't write, if they were doing it in English, it wouldn't be Jesus. They'd just say JS and they put a line over it. And God, instead of theos, instead of THEOS, it'd be THS with a line over it. Same with Son, same with God. So if you have Jesus, and same with Christ. So if you have Jesus Christ, Son of God, all four of those words would be 2-letter abbreviations with lines over the top. Okay? And the abbreviations end the same way with an upsilon. So the idea of it being an accident is the scribe writes Jesus Christ with upsilon at the end of Jesus, upsilon at the end of God. Then his eye comes back to the page, and the next two words also end in upsilon, the next two abbreviations, and that his eye skips over from what he just copied to the fourth word that has that ending and thinks that's the word he just copied. And so he goes on from there. And so this happened very commonly where words would end in the same way, and the scribe's eye would skip from the thing that he did copy, thinking to another word that he thought he had copied and leaving out the intervening words. Does that make sense, or is that too?
No, it does make sense. So the scribe writes down 2 words that end in the same way. The following 2 words in the manuscript he's copying end in that same way. He looks back at what he's written, sees he's already written that, and assumes that he's finished with that sentence and moves on to the next line.
That's right. So that's a simpler way of putting it. But it's we could have just said that it's parablepsis occasioned by homoteleuton, which is what scholars call it.
Do that next time. That'd be great. We won't get complaints at all.
Parablepsis is a eye skip, and homoteleuton is words ending in the same way. So is this parablepsis occasioned by homoteleuton? So that's one of the options. I have when I was writing my book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, I considered that option. I ended up rejecting it, thinking that is not what happened. And the reason I rejected it was because scribes often do that, but usually when they're tired. And
Not
this is in verse 1.
This
is like, he's just written like 5 words. He's not tired yet. And he's like, and so it seems unlikely. So to me, it seems like it's more, I have to develop a lengthy argument, which I'm not going to do here, but I argue that in fact, it's not an accident. But if it's not an accident and somebody did it on purpose, what happened? Did somebody on purpose add it, or did somebody on purpose take it away? And it's really hard to figure out why somebody would take it away. But there actually is a reason for thinking that somebody might have added those words, Son of God, in line 1. And it's, okay, not to get in the weeds again, but it's because of what we talked about last time. in about Gnostic understandings of Jesus and various understandings of Jesus. There were people who said, Christians who said, that Jesus became the Son of God when he got baptized. When God said, "You are my beloved Son, today I've begotten you," or he says, "You are my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," that's the point at which Jesus became the Son of God. And the people who are saying that, especially, we know from the church fathers, especially like the Gospel of Mark. So the theory I advance in my books is that what happened is a scribe knew that heretics, Gnostics, were using this to say Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism, and he starts the gospel with Jesus being the Son of God before the beginning, so that he's the Son of God already well before the baptism. And though it simply added 2 words, and it solved the problem.
Thank you very much. We are going to take a brief break so everyone's brains can just reset. And we'll be back to talk about deliberate changes in the Gospel of Mark, why scholars think they're there and what kinds of things they're doing. And we have some information for you on a new course. Okay, so we have a new course. Dr. Jodi Magness is teaching a course titled Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas. And this is for people who have ever wondered if there's historical evidence behind the story of Herod trying to kill baby Jesus. So, renowned archaeologist Dr. Jodi Magness is digging into the facts behind the fearsome king. You'll not only learn the truth behind the massacre of innocents, but also uncover what archaeology reveals about Herod's real life, reign, and legacy. It records live on December 13th. You can sign up at bartehrman.com/Herod. And as always, use the code MJPodcast for an additional discount at checkout. Now, Jodi has done archaeology courses for us before, I believe, and they've been fantastic.
Jodi's dynamite. She's my colleague at UNC. I was chair when we hired her, and it's like the best thing that happened in my chairmanship. And she is one of the world's top archaeologists of ancient Israel, and she knows everything about this stuff. But she's also one of the things she's expert on is King Herod and the archaeological remains, because we have very interesting archaeological remains about Herod, and he figures in this Christmas story, and so she's going to be delving into that, and so this will be good. It'll be a very different take from somebody who looks at the literature side or the kind of the story side of it. She's going to be dealing with the archaeological evidence for what we know about Herod.
I think I'm hosting this one as well, so I'm going to be sitting there learning all of the things about Herod. It's very exciting. Now, back to our interview. We went over before the break accidental changes, the kinds of things you see and why they might occur in the Gospel of Mark, or any manuscript, but specifically Mark. What makes scholars think that scribes sometimes intentionally change the texts of Mark? I know you gave one example prior in that the title sentence of verse 1, but what other things?
Well, that one could go either way. There are people who think it was an accident, and there are people who think it was intentional. I happen to think it was intentional. There are other ones that they have to be intentional. I mean, so the big one that people may know about is happens at the very end. And so, as it turns out, the first verse and the last verses are textually problematic. At the very end is the resurrection narrative, and there's a huge chunk of text that is at the end that scholars are almost not quite universally, but almost universally convinced did not belong there. And so here's the deal. In Mark's gospel, as in the other gospels, Jesus dies on a Friday. He's buried that afternoon. Sunday morning, the women come to the tomb, and turns out the tomb's empty. And in Mark's gospel, so the other gospels have different ways of doing this final scene, but in Mark's gospel, what happens is the women come to the tomb. The tomb's empty, but a young man appears to them and says that you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He's not here. He's been raised. Go tell Peter and the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. And then Mark says, but the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. In our oldest manuscripts, that's where Mark's gospel ends. They don't tell anyone, so the disciples never hear it.
That's a problem.
It's a problem. And when anybody reads the gospel in that form, like in a modern translation, and they see that it ends there, they say, "What? it can't end there. Jesus appeared to people. His disciples saw him afterwards. What's this? And that's the same reaction the scribes had who were copying Mark. They got to the end and they said, what? It can't end here. Jesus appeared to the disciples. And so it looks like they've added an ending. The final 12 verses that you'll find in the King James Version, you'll find them in most versions still today, but usually they'll have some kind of brackets around them with a footnote saying that these were not in the oldest manuscripts and may not be original. They're actually not original. What happens is a scribe added these 12 verses, and in those verses, the women go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. The disciples go to Galilee. Jesus appears to them, and he gives them his farewell address where he tells them that they're to go make disciples of all the nations, baptize everyone, and the people who come to believe in him, they will be able to speak in tongues. They will be able to handle deadly snakes, and they'll be able to drink poison and it won't hurt them. And then he sends them off to preach the gospel. So there are really solid reasons that almost everybody thinks that this is not an original ending. The only people who think it is an original ending are mainly it's people who believe that the King James Version is the inspired word of God, and that the manuscripts don't matter for that so much. But people who are scholars, like everybody, I mean, I knew this when I was a fundamentalist. It's not like this isn't one of those liberal things. This is like everybody thinks. But if it was added, as it appears that it was, it wasn't by mistake. It wasn't like a slip of the pen. It's not like misspelling a word. You got 12 verses here. It's a whole section of this that was added. And so that I don't think that couldn't have been an accident.
Why is it that people think that is not the original ending? Is it just that there are earlier manuscripts without it, or are there other reasons?
There are a lot of reasons. And what textual scholars do is they look at every angle they can think of, and they provide a fairly comprehensive treatment. So there are comprehensive treatments of this. There are entire books written on this ending. And so the basic arguments are that when the oldest manuscripts were discovered, I mentioned Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. They're our oldest complete manuscripts of Mark, but they don't have this ending. It ends in verse 8 with a woman fleeing from the tomb. And so scholars said, wait, what? Whoa. But then they started looking at it, and there are all sorts of things in these final 12 verses that are weird. There are a bunch of words, something like 17 words in this final ending that are not used in the rest of Mark. They're just like regular words that Mark just doesn't use elsewhere. And so the writing style is very different from the rest of it. And it's a very difficult transition from verse 8 to verse 9. That wouldn't be what a normal writer would say. In verse 8 is the kind of hard to explain this in grammatical terms, but the subject of the sentence in verse 8 is Jesus. And after, if you have reference in Jesus, then the next sentence will say, and he did so and so and so and so. But in this case, it ends with Jesus as the subject. The next thing presupposes that the women are the subject. So grammatically, like it has a they, it starts talking about the women without introducing the women. It's just like they, as if like, but they weren't talking about they. They're talking about Jesus. So that's you don't get that in narratives normally. But also, Mary Magdalene gets introduced in verse 9, as if people don't know who she is, but they've just been talking about her. So apparently what's happened is there's some kind of other story floating around that a scribe decided needed to be in this text because it was incomplete. And so he tacked it on, even though it doesn't work with writing style or vocabulary. And it has these ideas. What, in my part of the world, we still have Appalachian snake handlers who take this passage very seriously, and during their worship services, they handle deadly snakes. And I've always thought that, in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, somebody maybe should say, actually, that wasn't originally in the Bible. He said, yeah.
So do scholars think that this last section was added just to make the story more complete, or are there theological reasons that might have influenced it?
Well, yeah, because I'd say both. I mean, the thing is that if the women don't tell the disciples and the disciples don't see Jesus, then of course, everybody says, well, like it can't be the ending, because obviously the disciples did see Jesus because Christianity started. And the problem there is they're confusing a story with history. Mark, if Mark does end in verse 8, which it appears he does, then there's got to be a reason for him ending there. And one explanation of that is that it fits perfectly well with the rest of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is unique among the four in stressing that Jesus' identity is secret and his disciples can never figure him out. At the beginning of the gospel, on several occasions, Jesus keeps saying he'll do some miracle. They won't get it. He said, don't you understand? Don't you know who I am? Later, when somebody finally says who he is, it's Peter who says you're the Messiah, but then it immediately shows he doesn't even know what he's talking about, because he doesn't realize Jesus has to die. And every time Jesus says to his disciples after that he has to go to Jerusalem and die, his disciples say, no, that's not what's going to happen. You're not going to die. And they don't understand. And Mark ends his gospel with them not understanding. So it's that, but there's also this really nice irony, which is that throughout the gospel, Jesus tries to keep his identity secret from other people. And so the secrecy of Jesus is really important. But the interesting thing is that in the gospel, already in chapter 1, he'll tell somebody or heal somebody and say, don't tell anyone. And the person will go off and tell everybody. But here at the end, the women are told, go tell, and they don't tell. It's a perfect little flip of the scene there. Yeah.
So that's a pretty substantial change, adding on an entire ending to the gospel.
Yeah.
What do you consider to be some of the other significant changes in the Gospel of Mark?
Well, there are a couple that are pretty interesting that people probably wouldn't know about, that are like just, they involve a word, basically. This passage I just said about him telling people, this person he heals not to heal anybody, is a very interesting passage. It's a passage where Jesus heals a leper. So it's somebody who has some kind of skin disease, maybe Hansen's disease, or, it's maybe rotting flesh, or we're not quite sure what it was. It's somebody who has leprosy. And in the Old Testament, people who have leprosy are to be separated from society. You're not supposed to associate with them. They have to live off by themselves. They are rejected by the rest of society. So it's not a good thing. Plus, it's painful, and people would lose limbs and things. And so this person comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, if you, I know that you can help. If you're willing, you can heal me, and you can make me clean, he says. And the text in Mark says, this is Mark chapter 1, verse 41. In most manuscripts, it says, and feeling compassion, reaching out his hand, Jesus touched him and he says, I'm willing, be cleansed. And he gets healed. And then it says, Jesus strictly warned him and cast him out and threw him out. Okay. So the thing is, that word, feeling compassion for him, in some of our oldest manuscripts, it doesn't say feeling compassion for him. It says, and getting angry. Reaching out his hand, he touched him and says, I'm willing, and he healed him. Getting angry? What? And so in Greek, it's a difference of two words, splanknestheis, feeling compassion, and orgistheis, feeling anger. And so which is it? And the vast majority of manuscripts have feeling compassion. So there's that. But there's also the question of, suppose you're a scribe and you're copying this text, and a scribe is changing it. They're either changing it from being compassionate to being angry, or they're changing it from being angry to being compassionate. Which direction is a Christian scribe likely to go? Is he likely to change Jesus' compassion to anger when this poor leper comes up to him, or the anger to compassion? Yeah, well, obviously it's more likely that the scribe's going to change anger to compassion. And so there's that, arguing that he originally said he became angry. But then there are other things too, including, here's a little interesting thing. Matthew and Luke both have this passage, and they both got it from Mark. Okay, in other words, they're copying it word from word from Mark. And so our first manuscript of this, is hundreds of years later, but Matthew and Luke are 20 years later or 10 years later. And so if they're copying it word for word, then you'd ask, well, which word do they copy? because if they got the same word, that would have been the word, right? Because they independently are both copying this. So in effect, for this passage, they're the first copyists we have. Okay, just some years later. What word do they have? Both of them leave the word out.
Oh, interesting.
So if it had said compassion, would there be a reason for them to leave it out? No. If it said anger, would there have been a reason to leave it? Yes. And as it turns out, there are other places in Mark's gospel where Jesus is said to get angry. It happens in chapter 3. It happens in chapter 11. There are these passages where it says he got angry. And whenever it says Jesus got angry, Matthew and Luke leave it out. Whereas wherever it says he felt compassion, they don't leave it out. so scholars use a number of arguments like this, so much so that it's kind of a split vote on this one. But even like the New International Version, I think it's done mainly by evangelical scholars. I think they've turned it to anger, except they don't translate it anger. It's something else like being aggravated. They've kind of softened it a little bit. But the word is wrath, feeling wrathful. And then, but see, once you have that, once you think, okay, look, he probably said he got angry, then the next step is trying to figure out why he got angry. And that's where it gets really interesting, because that's interpretation. But you can't interpret what the word means until you know what the word was. Right. And so you can't first interpret and then you can't first interpret and figure out the text. You got to figure out the text and do the interpretation.
So what interpretation do people have for the angry Jesus question?
Oh, yeah. The angry Jesus question. So I think there are a lot of options out there. Some people think that he's angry because society is kicked this man out, and he thinks it's not right that this man has to lead a separate life as a leper. But that doesn't quite make sense, because it's not society doing this. It's the law of God doing it. It's the Torah that says you can't do this. And it's unlikely Jesus got angry at the Torah. And so there's that. Some people think that Jesus is angry at the Torah. And so this is kind of an anti-Jewish reading of it. It's like, oh yeah, Jesus hated the Torah, man. and so there's that. What I think it is that when in Mark's gospel, the places that Jesus is explicitly said to get angry are places that involve healing. And in chapter 3, when he heals a man in the synagogue, the Pharisees are upset because he's done it on the Sabbath, and he gets angry at them because he thinks it's okay to heal on the Sabbath. Later in the book, there's a man whose son is possessed by a demon and is throwing himself in the fire and hurting himself. And the man asks for Jesus to heal him. And he says, if you're willing, you're able to. And Jesus gets angry. If you're willing, everything's possible with God. And he has this angry response. And in every case, it seems to be that Jesus gets angry when somebody questions his ability or desire to heal somebody. And so that's a kind of a sub theme within Mark, I think. Interesting.
So it's not that the request has been made, it's that there's a question of whether Jesus can and will do it.
Yeah. Would you be willing to do this? What are you talking about? Would I be willing to do this? What's wrong with you?
Ridiculous
Of course I'm willing to do this. Get out of here. And the next thing, remember when Jesus heals this leper, as I said, it then says, and he sternly warned him and he cast him out. It's the same words that are used when he talks about casting out demons. So he's really ticked off at this guy. It's like, wow, really? But the thing, when you read Mark's gospel, this is only in Mark, but if you just read the first six chapters of Mark carefully and ask, how is Jesus being portrayed? I have my students do this with Mark. Just read the first 6 chapters, ignore what you think about Jesus, what you've heard about Jesus, read them. What's Jesus' personality type? And I'll have students say, I had no idea you'd get so angry about so many things. Man, he seems kind of rough. Yeah, man, he's a man of authority in the first 6 chapters of Mark, who is not to be messed with by anyone or anything. And so he's not the good shepherd of the stained glass window. He's really he's a fierce authority there, and this contributes to that view.
Thank you. Now, we're nearly out of time, but I did want to ask before we finished up whether there were any changes in Mark that appear to have been made for the theological position that the scribe took.
Yes. And so the one in verse 1 would have been like that. But another one that's really kind of a little more interesting is in chapter 6, verse 3. This is the passage in Mark where Jesus' mother and brothers and sisters come to meet him. In chapter 6, Jesus is in Nazareth, and it says his mother, and names 4 of his brothers and sisters. And the people in the synagogue, Jesus is preaching in the synagogue, and they can't believe that this guy is preaching all these things. And it says in Mark's gospel, it says, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" And so how's he get all this wisdom? Like, he's the guy who fixes your gate. How's he know all this about the Torah? And so that's the one passage in the New Testament that identifies Jesus as a carpenter. That's it. That one verse, chapter 6, verse 3 of Mark. Some scribes have changed it to say, "Isn't this the son of the carpenter?"
I see.
Or it originally said the son of the carpenter, and somebody changed it to, "Isn't this the carpenter?" So which is it? Either way would be significant. Matthew has the same verse. The other gospels don't. Matthew has it. And in Matthew, it's the son of the carpenter, not the carpenter. So what did Mark originally have? And the reason it's disputed is because either one has problems. If you say Jesus was a carpenter, the word is tekton. It means somebody who works with their hands. It was understood in wider society to be a lower form of employment. And that it wasn't like, it was actually mocked by the elites as being like one of these things. Oh, God, yeah, okay. He's a construction worker or something, like, the people are elitists and they say stuff like that. So the word is tekton, and that's listed among some scholars, some ancient people, as being like, okay, low class. And so maybe they didn't want him to kind of be said to be like that, and so they changed it. Well, he's the son of the carpenter. So where to get all this on? But the problem with saying he's the son of a carpenter is it makes Joseph his father, which means he wasn't born of a virgin. And in Mark's gospel, there's nothing about him being born of a virgin. So would they change it because he's the son of the carpenter to carpenter? You see, so either way, you've got something dealing with the understanding of Christ that's affected. And so you have to make a decision. I think most textual scholars think that it originally said carpenter, and that Matthew was uncomfortable with that, changed it to the son of the carpenter. And some scribes were influenced by knowing Matthew's version of it, and so changed Mark accordingly.
That is a really thorny problem.
It's thorny, and it's not one you would expect. But yeah, but you get unexpected things when you study these manuscripts, and some of them are interesting ways it wouldn't occur to you. And so, but there are lots of changes in Mark. And most are accidental, some are intentional, but the intentional ones end up mattering. I mean, how he begins his gospel, how he ends his gospel, how he portrays Jesus. I mean, it's pretty important.
Well, Bart, thank you very much. We are about out of time for the interview portion of this episode. So we're going to move on to this week's bonus segment, which is listeners' questions.
How well do we really know the Gospels that shaped Christianity? The New Testament books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the cornerstones of our understanding of Jesus, but how reliable are they as historical documents? In The Unknown Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, join Bible scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman as he takes you on an illuminating journey through these ancient texts. Across 8 captivating lectures, you'll explore the origins, authorship, and historical accuracy of the Gospels in an online course. Are these accounts based on eyewitness testimony, or are they a mix of history, myth, and legend? What do historians see that most readers miss? This course is an opportunity to dive deep into the stories that have defined a faith, questioning their origins and understanding their impact. Ready to uncover the truth behind the Gospels? Visit bartehrman.com/Gospels to learn more or sign up today. Use discount code MJPodcast at checkout for a special offer.
Okay, we have excellent listeners' questions. First up is about the Gospel writers and their familiarity with Greek literature. So the question asks, the Gospel authors knew enough Greek to write books in that language, so had presumably read other, perhaps pagan literature also in Greek. Do we have any idea what and how it influenced them?
We have some ideas, and the scholars have different views about it. But certainly, somebody who could write this quality of Greek would be well educated in comparison with the broader population. These four authors are not like among the high-level literary elite in Greek-speaking world. Other like people who were elite, who like later started realizing you had these gospels, look at them and they would just roll their eyes at the quality of Greek. But they're still better educated than 99% of the rest of the population, or so. And so they are high, but that meant they would have gone through Greek educational system, and at the higher levels that they would have gone through, one of the thing you did is you read the classics, and so you'd read Homer, and you'd read the Greek dramatist, you read the you read Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, especially Euripides. And so so they certainly did. The question is, did that influence their storytelling? Again, there are controversies about that. There have been some scholars that have argued, for example, that the Gospel of Mark is dependent on Homer's Odyssey, or that this classical author has influenced this book. I think the evidence of direct influence is very thin. It's very thin evidence in my judgment. I'm very attracted to the idea. I've just finished writing an article that shows how the relationship of the gospel narrative's account of Jesus' resurrection are similar and different in ways from one of Euripides' plays, the Alcestis. Very interesting how somebody comes back from the dead, brought back from the dead by a god. And so it's very interesting similarities, but I don't think there's any evidence of direct dependence.
Next two questions are about the nativity story. Was Matthew's nativity story included in the original gospel?
I think so. We don't have. We not only don't have any manuscripts that lack it, but it's completely integral to the story that follows. It works well as a beginning in Matthew. It makes sense as a beginning in Matthew. So it may not have been, but the writing style's there, the vocabulary. So there isn't anything about Matthew's beginning, in my judgment. There's nothing about Matthew 1 and 2 to make you think that it didn't originally start there.
And did Jesus ever claim to be born of a virgin, or was that story made up after his death?
Well, he never claims it in the New Testament. The only places where he's born of a virgin, as I said, were in Matthew and Luke, those first two chapters of each book, Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2. Neither author mentions it after that, after chapter 3. Jesus never says a word about it. And there's no evidence that any of the other writers of the New Testament knew about it. There's some suggestion that the author of John, for example, and the author of Mark, it really appears that Mary is his mother and that Joseph is his father. And in one point in the Gospel of John, some of his Jewish enemies, they have this line, I think this is chapter 8, where Jesus is, they're having this kind of back and forth with Jesus, and they're kind of insulting each other. And they say, well, we weren't born out of wedlock. Whoa. And so one idea that people floated is that later traditions you get in Jewish sources than in pagan sources is that Jesus was known to have been born out of wedlock, and that Mary had an affair, or she had been raped or something. And there's a question about whether John supports that or not. But so no, the answer is no. There's nothing about Jesus knowing this. Historically, no. I don't think there's no way. These are later stories. The first time we hear of anything like this is in Matthew, which is about 55 years after Jesus died, about 85 years after he was born.
Final question about the letters of Paul. You've spoken before about how scholars are convinced the undisputed letters of Paul all hang together in writing style and have a relatively consistent theology. So therefore, they're very likely written by the same author. How do scholars then determine that that author was the historical Paul and not a single particularly prolific forger?
It could have been a forger. One question is why a forger would forge a letter in the name of Paul if Paul never wrote letters. And so usually when you have a forger, they're forging a figure who's known to have written. So we start having Pauline forgeries at the end of the first century. So probably around the year 80 or 90, it's well known that Paul's written a number of letters. We have all the letters claim to be written by Paul. The letters the situations that they presuppose make sense as having happened in the first century of the Common Era. The kinds of issues that are being addressed are issues more prominent then than they are later. The later issues that become problems later are not mentioned then in these letters. So you appear to have an author who's writing in the middle of the first century. He calls himself Paul. These letters have a consistent style. It's written by a person who's known to be an author, Paul, and there's no reason within these letters to doubt the ascription. So if you think Paul didn't write them, okay, fine. As a historian, you have to entertain every possibility. You have to take on every hypothesis. And so if you want to advance that as a hypothesis, in this case, you need pretty good evidence for it. You need pretty good evidence to show that Paul did not write 1 Timothy. And it takes a lot of effort to show Paul did not write 1 Timothy, but I think you can show it with a lot of effort. So I have no qualms against showing that some of these books were not written by Paul. But, the evidence you have for 1 Timothy, you don't have for something like Galatians. And so I think you should consider the possibility, but I think it is a really tall hill to climb.
Thank you very much, Bart. Audience, thank you all for your questions. Now, before we finish up for the week, Bart, could you remind us what we spoke about today?
Well, today we're talking about the Gospel of Mark and the changes that scribes made when they were copying the text. The ultimate question for many people is, can we know what Mark originally wrote? My view is we have a pretty good idea in most places, but there are some passages where we don't know. And there are some passages that there are debates about among scholars, and there are some passages that matter a lot finding out. And so it's a worthwhile enterprise trying to determine what Mark wrote, recognizing that in some places we may never know.
And if you listened to this whole episode and thought, that's fantastic, I'm glad to hear about Mark, what about the other three? We will be getting to them. Don't worry, they are scheduled. Audience, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember, you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com, and that includes Dr. Jodi Magness's new course on Herod. The web address for that is bartehrman.com/Herod. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. Bart, what are we talking about next time?
Next time we are entering into the holiday season, and we are going to take on a very important issue. Is the Christmas story a myth? What actually does a myth mean? And how would you determine whether the things described in the narratives of the New Testament about Christmas actually happened or not? We're going to see.
Make sure you join us then. Thank you all, and goodbye.
This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.